Hello friends, welcome to the Point. In today's session, we'll be discussing about development experiences of India. So we'll be comparing the development with our neighbor countries. Over the last 2 decades, the economic transformation that is taking place in different countries across the world, it is partly because of the process of globalization. It has both short as well as long-term implications for each and every country and including India. So nations have been primarily trying to adopt various means which will strengthen their own domestic economies, and to this effect they are forming regional and global economic groupings such as SAARC, European Union, ASEAN, G8, G20, BRICS and so on. So in addition to this, there is also an increasing eagerness on the parts of various nations to try and understand the developmental process that is pursued by the neighboring nations, as it allows them to better comprehend their own strength and weakness through their neighbors. So in this unfolding process of globalization, so this is particularly considered very important by the developing countries, as they face competition not only in the form of developed nations but also among themselves in the relatively limited economic space that is enjoyed by the developing world. And in this session, we'll be comparing the developmental strategies that is pursued by India and the largest two of its neighboring economies. One is Pakistan and the other is with China. So it has to be remembered that despite being endowed with vast natural resources, there is little similarity between the political power setup of India, the largest democracy of the world, which is wedded to a secular and deeply liberal constitution for more than half a century. So, and the militarist political power structure of Pakistan or the command economy of China that has only recently started moving towards a democratic system and more liberal economic restructuring. Developmental path. So let's have a snapshot view about this. So do you know that India, Pakistan and China, they have many similarities in their developmental strategies. And all these three nations, that is India, Pakistan and China, they have started towards the developmental path at a time. And while India and Pakistan, it became independent nation in the year 1947. And whereas China, it was established in 1949. So once in a speech, Jawaharlal Nehru said that this new and revolutionary changes in China and India, even though they differ in content, they symbolize the new spirit of Asia and new vitality which is finding expression in the countries in Asia. So all the three countries, they had started planning their developmental strategies in similar ways. And India announced its first 5-year plan for 1951 to 56. And Pakistan announced its first 5-year plan, and now it is called the Medium-Term Developmental Plan in the year 1956. And China announced its first 5-year plan in the year 1953. So until March 2017, India has been following 5-year plan-based development model. India and Pakistan, they adopted similar strategies such as creating a large public sector and rising public expenditure on social development and so on. Until 1980s, all the three countries, they had similar growth rates and per capita income. And today, a lot has changed. Coming to China, so after the establishment of People's Republic of China under one party rule, all critical sectors of the economy, enterprises and lands owned and operated by individuals that were brought under government control. The Great Leap Forward campaign, that is initiated in 1958, it aimed at industrializing the country on a massive scale. So according to GLF, people were encouraged to set up industries in their backyards. So in rural areas, communes were started, and under the commune system, people collectively cultivated lands. And in 1958, there were 26,000 communes covering almost all the farm population. GLF campaign, it met with many problems. A severe drought caused havoc in China, killing nearly about 30 million people. And when Russia had conflicts with China, it withdrew its professionals who had earlier been set up to China to help in industrialization process. And in 1965, Mao, he introduced the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, under which the students and professionals were sent to work and learn from the countryside. The present day fast industrial growth in China, so it can be traced to the reforms that is introduced in the year 1978. So China introduced reforms in phases, and in the initial phase, reforms were initiated in agriculture, foreign trade and in investment sector. In agriculture, for example, let's say commune lands were divided into small plots which were allocated to individual households, and they were allowed to keep all income from the land after paying some fixed taxes. And in the later phase, reforms were initiated in the industrial sector, and private sector firms in general and township and the village enterprises, that is those enterprises which were owned and operated by local collectives, they were allowed to produce goods. And at this stage, enterprises owned by government, that is known as SOE, which means state owned enterprises. In India, we call it as public sector enterprises. So the reform process of China, it involved dual pricing. This means fixing the prices in two ways. Farmers and industrial units, it were required to buy and sell fixed quantities of inputs and outputs on the basis of prices fixed by the government, and the rest it were purchased and sold at the market prices. And over the years, production increased. The proportion of goods or inputs it transacted in the market, it also got increased. And in order to attract foreign investors, special economic zones were set up. Pakistan. So while looking at various economic policies that Pakistan adopted, so we can notice many similarities with India. So Pakistan also follows mixed economy model with coexistence of public and private sectors. So in the late 1950s and 1960s, Pakistan introduced a variety of regulated policy framework. So this policy it combined tariff protection for manufacturing of consumer goods together with direct import controls on competing imports. So the introduction of Green Revolution, it led to the mechanism and increase in public investment. And finally, it led to a rise in the production of food grains. This changed the agrarian structure. And in 1970s, nationalism of capital goods industries took place. So Pakistan then shifted its policy orientation in the late 1970s and 1980s. So when the major thrust areas were denationalization and encouragement of private sector. So during this period, Pakistan, it also received financial support from Western nations and remittance from continuously increasing outflow of immigrants to the Middle East. And this helped the country in stimulating economic growth. Demographic indicators. So now we shall compare some demographic indicators of India, China and Pakistan. So the population of Pakistan is very small and accounts for roughly about 1/10 of China or India's population. So even though China is the largest nation and geographically it occupies the largest area among the three nations, its density is low. So this table, it shows the population growth as being the highest in Pakistan, so followed by India and then by China, which is about 0.5. So here the scholars point out the one-child norm that is introduced in China in the late 1970s as a major reason for low population growth. They also state that this measure, it led to a decline in the sex ratio, the proportion of females per 1000 males. So from this table we can also notice that the sex ratio is very low and biased against females in all the three countries. So scholars say that the preferences for sons in all this country as a reason. The fertility rate is also low in China and very high in Pakistan. So urbanization is also high in China, with India having 33% of its people living in urban areas. Gross domestic product and sectors. So one of the most spoke issues around the world is about China and its growth of GDP, that is the gross domestic product. China has the second largest GDP of about $19.8 trillion, whereas India's GDP is only $8.07 trillion and Pakistan GDP is about $0.94 trillion and roughly about 12% of India's GDP. India's GDP is about 40% of China's GDP. So many countries, many developed countries, they were finding it very difficult to maintain a growth rate of even 5%. So China was able to maintain nearly double-digit growth for 1 decade. You can see this in this table. Notice that in 1980s, Pakistan was ahead of India. China was having double-digit growth and India was at the bottom. In 2011 to 2015, there has been a decline in India and China's growth rates, whereas Pakistan met with drastic decline at 4%. So we learned that China and Pakistan, they have more proportion of urban population than India. And in China, due to topographic and climatic conditions, the area suitable for cultivation, it is very small. That is only about 10% of its total land area. The total cultivable area in China, it accounts for 40% of cultivable area in India. So until 1980s, more than 80% of the people in China were dependent on farming. as their sole source of livelihood. And from then on, the government encouraged people to leave their fields and pursue other activities like handicrafts, commerce, transport, and so on. So in 2014 to 15, so with 28% of its workforce, it engaged in agriculture. Its contribution to GDP in China is 9%. So in both India and Pakistan, the contribution of agriculture to GDP were 17 and 25%. But the proportion of workforce that works in this sector is more in India. That is about 50%. So in Pakistan, it was only about 43%. The sectoral share of output and employment, it also shows that in all the three economies, the industry and service sector, they have less proportion of workforce but contribute more in the terms of output. In China, manufacturing and service sectors, they contribute highest to GDP at 43 and 48%. So whereas in India and Pakistan, it is the service sector that contributes the highest by more than 50% of GDP. So in both India and Pakistan, the service sector, it is emerging as a major player of development. So it contributes more to GDP, and at the same time, it emerges as a prospective employer. So if we look at the proportion of workforce during 1980s, Pakistan was faster in shifting its workforce to service sector than India and China. So in 1980s, India, China and Pakistan, it employed 17, 12 and 27% of its workforce in the service sector. And in 2014, it has reached the level of 29, 43 and 34%. That is 29 in India, 43 in China and 34 in Pakistan. In the last 3 decades, the growth of agriculture sector, which employs the largest proportion of workforce in all the 3 countries, it has declined. And in the industrial sector, China has maintained a nearly double-digit growth rates, whereas for India and Pakistan, growth rate has declined. Indicators of human development. So let us look how India, China and Pakistan, they have performed in some of the select indicators of human development. So in this table, China is moving ahead of India and Pakistan. And this is true for many indicators. And income indicators such as GDP, per capita or proportion of population below poverty line, or health indicators such as mortality rates, access to sanitization, literacy, life expectancy and so on. So Pakistan is ahead of India in reducing proportion of below the poverty line and also its performance in sanitation. So in China, for 1 lakh births, only 27 women die, whereas in India and Pakistan, about 178 and 174 women die. So you can see the Human Development Index value and the rank that is based on HDI, that is Human Development Index, life expectancy at birth, GDP per capita, maternal mortality rate, infant mortality rate and so on. You can compare it with China and Pakistan. Development strategies. So it is common to find developmental strategies of a country as a model to others, and it is particularly evident after the introduction of reform process. So in order to learn from economic performance of our neighboring countries, it is necessary to have an understanding of the roots of their successes and failures. And it is also necessary to distinguish between and contrast the different phases of their strategies. Even though the countries go through their development phases differently, let us take the initiation of reforms as a point of reference. So we know that the reforms were introduced in China in 1978, Pakistan in 1988, and India in 1991. So why did China introduce structural reforms in 1978? So China did not have any compulsion to introduce reforms as dictated by the World Bank and IMF to India and Pakistan. The new leadership at that time in China was not happy with the slow pace of growth, and there was a lack of modernization in China's economy. They felt that the Maoist vision of economic development, it was based on decentralization, self-sufficiency, and shunning of foreign technology and so on. So but all this had failed. So despite extensive land reforms, collectivization, and the GLP, which is known as Great Leap Forward, and other initiatives, the per capita grain output of 1978, it was the same as it was in the mid of 1950s. So in Pakistan, most foreign exchange earnings, they came from remittances from Pakistani workers in the Middle East and exports of highly volatile agricultural products. And there was also growing dependence on foreign loans, and the difficulty was increasing in paying back those loans. And however, during the last few years, Pakistan was recovered its economic growth and it has been sustaining. In 2015-16, the annual plan, that is 2016-17, reports that the GDP registered a growth of 4.7%. It is highest when compared to the previous 8 years. And while agriculture sector, it recorded growth rate far from the satisfactory level, industrial and service sector, it grew at 6.8 and 5.7%. And many macroeconomic indicators, they also began to show a stable and positive trends. So India, China and Pakistan, they had traveled more than 5 decades of developmental path with a varied results. Until the date 1970s, all of them were maintaining the same level of low development. And the last 3 decades, they have taken these countries to different levels. India, with democratic institutions, it performed moderately, but a majority of its people, they still depend on agriculture. Infrastructure is lacking in many parts of our country, and it is yet to raise the level of living of more than 1/4 of its population that lives below the poverty line. So we can also notice that unlike India and Pakistan, which are attempting to privatize their public sector enterprises, China has used the market mechanism to create additional social and economic opportunities. So by retaining collective ownership of land and allowing individuals to cultivate lands, China has ensured social security in rural areas, public intervention in providing social infrastructure. Even prior to reforms, it has brought about positive results in human development indicators in China. See you all in the next session with some other interesting topic. Thank you.